Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. This is yet again Lunch and Learn from the Nonprofit Management Program in the School of Professional Studies at Columbia University. I am Basil Smikle, the director of the program and professor of practice. We're going to give a minute for everyone to come into the session, but once again, it is wonderful to see all of you virtually and be with all of you for our monthly Lunch and Learn. Happy Friday, everybody. While everybody's coming in and we'll start in just a second, I want to take the time to say thank you to the team here, Lonnie, Vicky, and Andy, who are, as always, the bedrock of our program and remain so. I'm just the figurehead with the glasses, but they are the bedrock of our program. And I again want to thank them for all of their support. And we have some admitted students, some alum with us, and we certainly have some prospective students as well, so welcome. I hope that for the alum, I hope we make you proud. For the current students, I hope you're taking notes. For the prospective students, all of those things, plus make sure you apply. We are here to help and support. And again, thank you so much for coming in. So again, my name is Basil Smikle. I'm professor of practice and director of the master's program in nonprofit management here in the School of Professional Studies at Columbia University. Our April, what month are we in? We are in April. Our April Lunch and Learn. I'm already thinking of graduation, everybody. Our April Lunch and Learn, which is the last of the semester, is proud to welcome someone I've known, I think, just about my entire career. A young man named Craig Minassian, who is with us. He's got his own firm. He works for the Clinton Foundation. I want to let him go through his sort of background and how he got to where he is. But I've always leaned on him in the days when we used to work a lot together, when I used to work for Hillary Clinton in the Senate. Actually, you're always in the family, so we never sort of stopped working with and for each other. But in those early days when I got to know Craig, it was always a good person to lean on, a solid voice, and a really talented professional. So Craig, thank you so much for joining us today, and thanks for doing this.
Yeah, my pleasure. It's good to see you, my friend, and thank you for having me, and great to see all of you this afternoon. Happy to be here.
I am. Yeah, no, I think so. I am. I always say this. I'm a big fan of the Actors Studio. So, if you ever watch that show, James Lipton. I always start the way he did. Let's begin at the beginning. So, where are you from, my friend? And where are you from?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in suburban Boston, in Bedford, which, if you're a history buff, is wedged right between Lexington and Concord. And as they just this past weekend was the 250th anniversary of Paul Revere's ride in the battles of Lexington and Concord. So that's right where I grew up. I went to college at the University of Miami down in Florida. That took me to Los Angeles to HBO. And then from there, got involved in politics. So first, I got actually involved in the World Cup in '94, and all of that led me to meeting people that got me involved with a number of advocacy campaigns, including the attempted passage of universal health care. That led me to the Clinton re-election campaign, and then the White House, and then back to HBO, and then as you mentioned, I both after some time back at HBO decided to start my own business and help President Clinton with the foundation and get CGI underway and all of their various campaigns that you and I have been part of. And so today I serve as the Chief Content Communications and Marketing Officer for the foundation and for President Clinton and the Clinton Global Initiative. And then my other company, Minassian Media, we really specialize in a lot of big nonprofits, helping them with communications, Wikipedia and the Wikimedia Foundation, Bloomberg, and a number of others. So
That's
I can
wonderful.
yeah.
I mean, that's wonderful. I actually want to go into talk a bit about the Clinton Foundation, because it's it's not exactly the library museum, right?
Oh, it's
It's
a lot more
something,
than that.
it's a lot
Yeah.
more than that. So talk a bit about, and by the way, for those that want to ask questions, you can put your questions in the Q&A section and we'll get to them during the conversation. So please encourage everybody to ask questions away, and we'll do our best to get to all of them. So yeah, could you talk a bit about what is different about the Clinton Foundation? Because we hear about presidential libraries and museums. So what distinguishes what Bill Clinton has done?
Sure. It's a relatively recent phenomenon that former presidents started foundations, in part because, particularly starting with President Carter, they were a little bit younger coming out of office, and had the desire to do something more than just build the library. The libraries go back quite a long way, and the first libraries were really presidential homesteads, or the homes that they lived in most of their lives, turned into museums. But when President Carter really thought he would also start a foundation, that really set a template for um, other presidents that followed. All presidential foundations now sort of start with envisioning a library, and mostly, if you've gotten to the second term, you start thinking about, where are archives going to go? Where should it be? What should I do? How do I raise money for it? And that is what happened with President Clinton in the second term. Started thinking about where it should be, and obviously put the library in Arkansas. But also, what more could you do? What are the things that he wished he had more ability to do in office, and perhaps as a private citizen had more ability to do it? Or were there things in his case, as we've talked about, his HIV and AIDS work, that he wished he had done more of when he was president, that he was able to continue to address when he was out of office? So the first few years of the foundation, he left office in early 2001. Those first few months were setting up a post-presidential office and starting to think about what the foundation could do. We're an operating foundation. I'm sure you've covered this in your classes, but the difference between a grant making and an operating foundation. The Gates Foundation, which many people compare us to, is grant making. They give grants to other organizations, including us, that are aligned with their priorities, particularly in global health. Operating foundations are really more on the ground and running programs, which is what we do. And over time, we've had a number of programs that we've incubated, started, spun out. They've become their own foundations. One of those is the C40 Climate Leadership Group. That started at the Clinton Foundation, in partnership with the mayor of London and some other mayors, and ultimately grew. I think it's now about 80 cities, but at the time was 40 cities, where we had staff in the offices of the mayors to help them figure out how to do everything from retrofitting buildings to have more sustainable policies. And that's just one example of a program that the foundation incubated and grew. Probably besides the HIV and AIDS work, the thing we're best known for is the Clinton Global Initiative, which still exists to this day. And that was a very good example of something President Clinton saw when he was in office, and saw that there might be a different way to use these big thought leader conferences to address a problem. He, as many leaders went to a number of conferences, the World Economic Forum, Davos, and whatnot. And he thought that there were a lot of good ideas talked about at these conferences, but nobody was ever asked or empowered to do anything with those ideas. There'd be a panel, they'd say we could do this about global health or the environment, and then they walked away. And so in 2005, he started the Clinton Global Initiative to bring together governments, private sector, public sectors, to work together on new plans or projects to address specific issues. We called those commitments. They're really new philanthropic projects, and now there are about 4,000 of these commitments operating in 180 countries and helping about 500 million people around the world. So yeah, it's a lot more than just the presidential center. But if you're in Little Rock, I encourage you to to visit.
Well, and it's fascinating too, because I love what you said about the number one, going to these conferences, and there are a lot of great ideas, but there isn't as much implementation as one would like. And how is it having not only a former president of the United States, but still an extraordinarily popular one, and a younger one when he started, a fairly young one when he started, to be so passionate about the implementation side of the work, because I think that's something that gets lost a lot in these conversations, that somebody's actually got to be on the ground doing this stuff.
Yeah. Well, and it's not just him, it's Secretary
Yeah,
Clinton and Chelsea
right.
Clinton, and they all have that sort of same ethos of how you answer the how question. It's not enough to talk about there is a problem, but how are you going to address it? And one thing he saw as president was a lot of breakthroughs came in understanding. We talked a little bit about the HIV and AIDS work, but there was a case where there were great strides made in the United States. One of the things they were facing in the developing world was stigma, right?
Mm.
So governments didn't even want to acknowledge that there was a problem among their citizens. So as a global leader, in his case, helping them understand why that was counterproductive to getting a healthier um, citizenship was something that he could uniquely do, or leaders who have that experience in persuasion and putting things in a way that is relevant to them. It's not just because he thinks or the United States thinks something, it's how is this really, how do I see it from your point of view? And, all the president, secretary, and Chelsea are uniquely gifted at that. And that helps with implementation very much. There's also, he'll say, president will say a lot, our goal is to fill that gap between what the private sector can produce and what the public sector can provide. And that's getting
Mm.
organizations together who have similar interests but different resources and different abilities to work together to address these problems. That's sort of the perfect model of what we try to do.
And as you mentioned, the HIV/AIDS initiative, just to tell everybody sort of my experience with that, I got to travel to Tanzania, Lesotho, other places to open clinics. And one of the things that I was just amazed at is this point you talk about in terms of taking away the stigma of where countries were perhaps previously reluctant to talk about it openly. I mean, we dealt with that here in the U.S. Obviously for a long period of time. But there were also conversations, not just with governments, but with private sector organizations, pharma, to figure out how to bring everybody together to solve this, to help solve this problem. I remember he always used to say he wanted to make HIV and AIDS he wanted to come away from it being a fatal disease to a chronic one, like
Yeah.
something that is manageable. So could you talk a little bit about working with so many partners, particularly the private sector and pharma, to try to address these issues?
Yeah, this is another thing that he saw as president that he sort of ran out of time as president to do, but he got to address post presidency. So there's the stigma on behalf of particular governments. There's also the economics, and so the pharma and the big drug companies were making very effective treatments, but they were very expensive. And so, particularly when it came to places like Tanzania, um, they were there was a distribution problem, and part of that was the government, part of that was the supply chain, part of that was the price, and so it was a very high margin uh, business, and the drug companies had to be convinced that if they lowered the prices that they would make up for it in volume. Now, by the way, making up for it in volume also meant more people are getting treatment. So he was able to convince the drug companies to say, well, if we can get the governments to lower the barriers that make it difficult for distribution and get them to accept the fact that their citizenship needs treatment, will you lower the prices to a point that they can afford more of it? And they did. And then, so that's the drug companies. These are the countries. And then how do you distribute it? And that's where a number of organizations, including the Clinton Foundation, worked to create better distribution systems. So that's where the NGOs come in. So you have a government that is now, convinced that if they help more people get access to the treatment, that everybody will be better off. You have the drug companies saying, if more people get it, then I'm still protecting my margins, and we're having the effect that we want is more people on treatment. And then you have the NGOs filling that gap of how do you distribute it and how do you understand the local landscape. And so it was really a signature success. And then he was very proud. He worked with President Bush to support PEPFAR when he was president.
Right.
That really opened up a way for the U.S. government to support and make a huge difference. So it's not, he'll be the first to say nobody should claim sole credit, or he doesn't want to claim any kind of sole credit. The point is, how do you get more treatment to more people?
Now, from a comms standpoint, like what's it like, and what are some of the unique challenges or opportunities? I can imagine the opportunities to do communications for the Clinton Foundation when you have such a president who's so charismatic and wanted to do all of these things that were, I guess, at the time unprecedented.
Yeah, as your students may know, particularly when Hillary ran for president, the foundation got just hammered with negative advertising, false rumors. It really became a political victim, which was unprecedented for a philanthropy to be targeted like that. And a campaign or a company that is responding to negative attacks has a lot of ability to do it. But if you're a nonprofit, it's not responsible to use donor money to say take out our own ads.
Yeah.
So it is a blessing because the president and Secretary Chelsea explain things. They have a high profile. People follow them. They care about what they do. But it has some downsides too that you just have to navigate, which is particularly now in a more polarized world, people have a perspective on it that isn't always based in fact. And so as a communications person, you're trying to educate people about what we do. And that, there's something important about that too. I just want to say, because it's not just the Clinton Foundation. One thing we've learned as we've gone through this is that there is a broad, for as important as the nonprofit sector is in American society, and in any given year, if you look at the Bureau of Labor statistics, anywhere for just below or just above 10% of the U.S. workforce is in the nonprofit sector. And that's just the workforce. That doesn't even count the impact, everything from, as President Clinton says, the volunteer fire department or the PTA in the community, all the way up to the Gates or Rockefeller foundations. It is probably the least understood sector, particularly for the impact that it has. And that's something that for anyone, not just us, when you're doing communications is something to consider and something to overcome. People are very familiar maybe with their PTA because it's in their community, or the Red Cross because they instantly connected with disaster. It's a much harder thing to educate people about organizations that have operating models like ours, and particularly when you're doing global development work. Is one of the things we're seeing right now is people are very focused on what's happening here, and it's easier to tune out other places that are really in tremendous need.
Which actually brings us. There's a question from Shannon. How do you encourage technically focused, grant-funded staff to adopt a more entrepreneurial mindset, especially when pivoting toward private sector funders like VCs, as public funding shrinks and NGOs need to be creative staff?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I don't know that we have the perfect answer for it, but I'll talk a little bit about what we do with the Clinton Global Initiative. So, in part because the president, as I was just talking about with our HIV and AIDS work, also understands that market solutions are an important part of this. That's sort of a more natural entree point to VCs and other things, other private sector organizations. Um, the Clinton Global Initiative is very much a place of discovery. People come with their ideas. These commitments are really groundbreaking projects, and so this is where I think communications helps. It's not just a philanthropic project. It's a new idea that could be scalable. And now you're talking about it in a language that other funders typically use when they're investing in a new technology or something else. So um, that's one way to do it. That's where we found some success with it.
No. And so, and we sort of talked a little bit. I mean, the question sort of deals with it, and we've talked a little bit around it. You have. I mean, what are some of the challenges you're really seeing in this environment? I know we talked about, people really focused on what's happening at home and maybe less interested or less willing to think about what's happening abroad and how we as the United States can be helpful and supportive and the benefits that accrue to us as a result of that. But what are the challenges that you see, not just immediately, but sort of the groundwork that's been laid that may have to be addressed 4 years from now, 5 years from now, because of what's happening today,
Yeah.
the with USAID and so on.
Well, I think people don't. You mostly it's that, at least to our point of view, people don't really understand what USAID, what grant making is, what soft power is, where foreign aid fits within diplomacy. Um, in a certain sense, I think this is an experience we had with the Clinton Foundation. People assume you're doing good work if you're a foundation. People for a long time assumed the government was making good decisions. Not everybody, but people generally thought,
Yeah.
there wasn't a lot of questioning about USAID. And so now, when it's being targeted, um, there's not as much of a counterbalance in terms of the knowledge base. So if you just say to the average person, and I think obviously your class is invested in the sector, and so probably have a more sophisticated appreciation for it, but that it's not just foreign aid. It's affecting American farmers. It's affecting American manufacturing. There's an interconnected part of the world. Um, that is important to recognize. When the U.S. is helping build a health system somewhere else, um, that is something that ultimately benefits the United States, because it means that there's perhaps a health crisis that either won't come here, or we won't spend billions of dollars later helping people avoid, and people will be healthier, and healthier communities are more productive, and all the reasons that we know. So I think there's an education factor that the sector is behind on, that is leading to, you know, um, letting these things be targeted in a way without that counterpoint. That's one challenge. Then there's fear. I mean, I think we see this in a lot of the organizations that come participate in CGI. Suddenly it is scary to stand up for your values, particularly for this sector, and that's something uh, you know it's ebbed and flowed throughout history. It's never been there. It's never been completely absent from the environment, but it's so pronounced now that I'm sure you've talked about in class, organizations that are even thinking about, should we change how we talk about what we do? I heard one example of a small climate organization that was thinking about stripping the words climate from their website because they thought it might make them a target. And so now we have an environment where people and organizations are literally afraid to do what they set out to do, and that
Yeah.
is new territory.
And yeah, I mean, you said this before that how do you justify using donor funds to? I mean, in some ways, you got to be able to tell your story, right, and talk about the good work that you do. But I imagine relatively small nonprofits don't have the ability to really do that in a consistent and effective way. So is there a solution to that? If not everybody's not going to be Bloomberg and CGI and so on. So as a comms expert, sort of, how do you talk to smaller organizations about helping them stand their ground, if you will?
Yeah. Well, part of it is sticking up for your values, and part of it is understanding the media landscape. And so,
Mm,
as recently as 2012, most of the major news organizations had philanthropy beats because the sector was so important. Um,
mm,
they came to find out that those philanthropy beats were not profitable, and they eliminated them. As you're seeing a lot of contraction and um, economic challenges to the media industry. So there's less appetite to get your story out through the media, less appetite on the part of the media. So that's one thing. So then it puts pressure on organizations, all organizations, to use the tools they do have. Social media. Obviously, we know there are problems with some platforms, direct donor communication, email, and whatnot, and they have to emphasize that. But everybody's trying to do that. So you want your story and your content to stand out. One of the things we try to do is something I learned at HBO when I was on the creative side was the narrative power of a good story and characters. And so, almost every story, whether it's a big action thriller or somebody working to solve the climate crisis, comes down to a few things. There's characters that are relatable, there's conflict, there's understandable stakes, and there's a ticking clock. And so, who are your characters that represent your organization? That can be people your grants are helping, it could be someone from the organization, but it's someone that you can build a story around. What is the conflict? In superhero movies, it's good guy versus bad guy. For us, it's the challenge of solving a problem. That might be a food desert. It might be um, sustainable agriculture. Could be a number of things. But that's setting up that conflict. And then, what are the stakes? What happens if you don't accomplish your mission? And then, why you need to do it in a particular time. We are running out of time. And so those are four things that sort of universally audiences understand: the characters, the conflict, stakes, and the ticking clock. And so, whether you're a big organization or a small organization, if you can think about your story in that way, you have a better chance of people gravitating to it. I think you're on mute,
sorry, I
Basil.
mean, I'm
Yeah.
sorry about that. And let me take a quick break just to remind folks that they can put a question to Craig in the Q&A. So we had a great question earlier, so please feel free to uh, put your questions into the Q&A, and we'll do our best to get to all of them. Secondly, again, thank you all who have joined us. Again, my name is Basil Smikle, Director of the Nonprofit Management Masters in Nonprofit Management program here at Columbia University, and welcoming our guest, Craig Minassian, to our monthly Lunch and Learn. I also want to say a quick hello and wave to Elizabeth Engelens, who's here. She's a new faculty member of ours who's going to be teaching a capstone course. So thank you, Elizabeth, for joining us here. Question here. I'm an alum from this program. One of my aha moments was when we learned that those in the field, quote unquote, are as much part of fundraising. Do you have examples of how you use those executing your programs to do the storytelling for fundraising? I guess maybe the question is, how do you recruit people to tell those stories? And how do you get, and maybe this is a riff on the question as well, how do your funders, do your donors help you tell the story?
Yeah. Well, when it comes to people in the field, they're an important source of storytelling. We started a video series last year called The Doers. And I think that's pretty self-explanatory. And that's important for the audience, right? It's not just we're talking about something, we're doing it, and we're going to introduce you to the people who are actually doing it and the impact that they're making. Um, Funders, this sort of goes back to something we learned in going through the storm of the 2016 campaign is we assumed when people were donating to the foundation that they understood the foundation. Now, the reality is some of them were donating to us because they like the Clintons, some of them like our climate work. People have so many, there's not a universal reason why people donate. So what we learned is we had to make sure that we were really keeping up and educating them about what we did and how we did it so they could be advocates and they could be surrogates in their circles. And it was also important when it came under scrutiny, and now a lot more organizations are under scrutiny, that your donors really understand what you do. So when they hear, attacks or misinformation, they go, well, that's not true. I know this
Mm.
organization. I know how they do things.
Right.
So it's a constant, hopefully virtuous cycle with them to keep them updated, so that they can be your advocates. And something what we found about donors and the media is that they themselves like to learn. So if there's something that they can learn from your organization about what's happening in the world or issues that just makes them, I mean, clearly they care about the world if they're supporting your organization, um, that makes them feel more, educated,
Yeah.
empowered, what have you. You can do that for them as part of your communications effort.
Thank you, and thank you, Jan Paul, for that question. That was a great question. We have two others waiting, but before I go to those questions, I really want to ask you about sort of the other side of your work, because you're doing consulting for a number of other organizations. So what's it like? You mentioned Bloomberg, and is Bloomberg, by the way, in sort of the same vein as the Clinton Foundation? And how is the consulting side of this work?
Yeah. So Bloomberg, it is in the same vein and sort of similar. They're similar priorities: global health, obviously climate. They do some convenings themselves. They're privately funded, so that's a big difference. They have, and Mike Bloomberg obviously has given, real significant sums to, so many issues. I mean, he's pledged to fulfill the our what the Paris Climate Accord, like they fulfill the U.S. commitment to that, making up gaps in the World Health Organization and others. One of the things we're doing for them right now is we're training their grantees in the anti-tobacco work that they have around the world. So they fund, organizations like Tobacco Free Kids and whatnot, help them prepare for attacks on them from the tobacco industry and other people who, want to, unfortunately want to see more people smoke or keep smoking, or,
Mm.
tobacco is their business. And so Bloomberg is very invested in healthy outcomes. You saw that as mayor.
Right.
So we help them in a communication standpoint. Wikipedia and the Wikimedia Foundation, that we represent them around the world. Everything from when Turkey blocked them a couple of years ago, how do you create a campaign to convince Turkey to unblock them, which had a number of different elements: communications, legal, legislative, and whatnot. To how do you recruit more people in particular topics to be editors? One of the things about Wikipedia is, and I think we all use it. And we all use it even if we don't know that we use it, because a lot of search results start out with Wikipedia. Um, Topics on Wikipedia like Call of Duty are hyper accurate because there's a very younger, engaged audience that cares about that, and they contribute to Wikipedia or
Call of
contribute
Duty, the video
information.
game?
Call of Duty video game, yeah.
Yeah,
And I'll come back
okay.
to that in a second. But there are topics like 18th century women American authors that doesn't have as much participation. So we try to come up with programs to uh, help them encourage more people, recruit more editors to come on and participate in the program. What I want to say about Call of Duty, it's not directly related to our work, but I found this fascinating as we talk about communications. Um, I was giving a talk at Miami, and some students came up to me after and said, "What do you think of how America is portrayed in Grand Theft Auto, which is another very popular video game?" And I
Yeah.
said, "I, I, I don't play the game. I don't know." And they were describing to me, and this was in the run up to the last election, that the backdrop, there was a very political and socioeconomic background to the games.
Yeah.
Whether it was cities that are ravaged, there were personifications of Trump and Biden within the games, and that particularly young men, which make up that most or a significant amount of the game players, that's how they're getting some of their information about politics and society, which I would have never thought of. But it just goes to show that as you're doing communications for a nonprofit, maybe you can't get in Call of Duty, but to think about all these different ways people are actually communicating, getting their perspective information in a very fractured environment.
No, it actually is quite fascinating because I remember, and then just the quick aside, you know, I'm a Gen Xer, so and you're a Gen Xer, right? So we bridged analog and digital, but we were
Yeah.
around for two really important movements. We were there at the birth of hip hop, and we were there at the birth of the home video game. I remember
Yeah.
getting my first Atari. It was my only Atari system, and it was very basic. You point, you shoot, you move, and that was pretty much it. But the storytelling that's involved in, and the world building that's involved in these video games, people really do get sort of brought into this in a way that we could never. Because I remember there was a time when people would say, video games are going to lead to violence, and we spent a lot of time refuting that. But we didn't spend as much time talking about how the current video game sort of environment may alter your worldview in a way. That's something that kind of did get overlooked for a
Yeah.
long time.
But you also
That's
bring up a really
fascinating.
important point, is
Yeah.
building a world. I certainly think our job as communicators and, in the particularly nonprofit sector, you're trying to build a vision of a better world, and a world that the donors, not only donors, citizens, stakeholders, beneficiaries, everybody can see themselves in. And so that is really part of our job. And I think when you think about it like that, it feels also less promotional. We're not just
Yeah.
promoting our work. We're creating an environment that we want to welcome people into participating in, because it's going to make a better world. And then, you can see all the narratives that flow from there.
It's sort of the back to Reagan's Morning in America commercial, right? It's this is the world we've created for you, right? It's
Yeah.
that commercial always stands out. Couple of questions. Karen, who's an admitted student, welcome, Karen. We're so excited to have you in the program. You make a great point. This is a question. You make a great point that the mission narrative is the strongest to tell in this environment. I wonder how, if at all, the impact measurement, ROI, data storytelling narratives have changed or have to change given the new environment.
Well, the impact and data-driven storytelling is really important, particularly for funders. Funders have become a lot more sophisticated about where they give their money. And even I'll come back to the core question in a second, but one thing that we've seen even in corporate philanthropy over the time that we've been doing the Clinton Global Initiative, that corporations were always trying to be responsible to most corporations were trying to be responsible to the communities that they were in. So if they had a manufacturing plant in, say, Alabama or Mississippi, they were supporting local schools and organizations and trying to be responsible for where their people lived and worked. Over the last few years, we've seen much more enlightenment about supply chains, sourcing, responsibility writ large at a corporate level, not just where their people live and work, but what they mean to customers, what they mean to the, all up and down the supply chain, as I mentioned. Um, so that is part of the storytelling, being able to tell that story. Um, I think in the current environment, this goes back to the education point. I mean, important data points. They're not just numbers on a page; they're people. I think you can connect that as much as you can and understand. As I was talking about USAID, that USAID is not only something that helps, in Malawi. It's something that helps in Michigan because it's all interconnected. So that's important. Not. I don't. I think some organizations I found struggle with that. Say, well, we're not a big global organization. We have a small staff, small mission. How can we possibly tell a big enough story for people to care? Um, you know, this one of the most viral, successful charitable fundraisers the last few years was the Ice Bucket Challenge, where
Right.
I think this is actually the 10th anniversary of it, but it was a young man who had ALS. He was a college athlete in Boston. His family and friends started this challenge, and one person's story took off and um, made a huge difference in millions of people's lives. So there's never too small to have a good story that can grab people's attention.
Thank you, Karen, for that great question, which leads to Carlene's question, I think, in a way, as you talk about social media. How are you utilizing AI in your communications work and strategies? And how can nonprofits use AI without being too afraid of the potential consequences?
Well, I think particularly for not just small organizations, any organizations, it is a really effective tool for drafting things. Drafting press release. We don't use it for speeches because the president has a very strong hand. I like to tell our speechwriters who are extraordinary that once you've written a speech, when you hear him say thank you and good night, you can know that he used your words because he may rewrite the entire thing in real time. But a lot of organizations will use AI as a first draft of speeches, executive communications, emails, and that's all very valid. It's time saving. It's getting better, particularly if you have a small staff. It's an economical use of it, but it doesn't. To me, it doesn't eliminate the need to have some human oversight. There's a fairly well known philanthropy. I won't say who it is. They use AI to create their in monthly newsletters, and the monthly newsletters that came out in the last couple months, at least I felt, had rather tone deaf leads to the
Mm,
newsletter. One was about Groundhog's Day, one was Happy Spring, and AI may tell you that that's a way to engage audiences, and that may be right. Like there's a sort of friendly way to get into the conversation. But in the environment right now and what the social sector is going through, it just landed in a way that AI didn't quite understand. So
mm,
it's a powerful tool. I don't think people should be afraid of it, but it does. You can't just outsource everything to it. It's still, it's good for doing drafts, and from there, you should do oversight. Then it's good for research. I mean, we were looking at a tool the other day that uh, we would love to know. One thing about communication strategy is how do you measure it? There's
mm,
engagement, there's
mm,
sentiment. Maybe that's through positive stories. There's brand reputation. Typically, for a nonprofit, the brand reputation part is expensive. As Basil, you and I know, like polling, can be really expensive, but it's useful. There
mm.
are some AI tools that are making that a lot less expensive and giving you maybe not as granular details you might get from political polling, but gives you a baseline for understanding how people are perceiving what you do. So that's another really great use of it.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that great question. Um, Anyone that still has a question for Craig, please feel free to put it in the Q&A. I want to do a zoom out question a little bit, a bit of a retrospective as you look back on your career. I'm not ready to give you the lifetime award yet because it's not the thank you and goodbye. It's you still have a lot of work to do, clearly. But as you look back on your career and you think about not just your personal trajectory, since we have a lot of students, current and incoming students on the Zoom. As you look back at your career, talk a little bit about some of the things that you've learned and some of the things that sort of stay the same, that continue to sort of be pillars of your career, of your decision making, in your career. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm very lucky to have a lot of incredible experiences. When I was in college, I took every internship and volunteer opportunity I could. I wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to do. I had some areas I was really interested in. News and politics, entertainment, and sports. And I kind of thought that these were really distinct areas. Um, I got an opportunity to intern for HBO on the show Comic Relief, which, maybe the class may not remember, but I know we do. It
Yeah.
was pretty groundbreaking charity at the time that Billy Crystal, Robin Williams, and Whoopi Goldberg hosted. and it was a series of fundraisers, all based on comedy. They were like telethons that went to raise money for healthcare for the homeless. And in the '92 campaign, Tipper Gore was a huge advocate for the homeless, and so it ended up being a place when I worked on the show that I was able to meet a lot of people who worked on the '92 campaign. So I thought I was doing entertainment. I was very interested in issues as well. And so this gave me the opportunity, but in a very hands-on way, to look at this really critical issue I didn't know much about homelessness and the challenges and things that could be done. And I met obviously people who were involved in politics through that. That led me to the World Cup. So the World Cup, when it was here in '94, was a massive organizing undertaking. And it was, yes, it was sports, but when I had the opportunity to apply my skills to that, and that they also hired a number of people who primarily had done campaigns because of the scale of the organizing, and also the goal of not just putting on this major international sports tournament, but laying the groundwork for communities to want to play soccer, start our
Mm.
pro league with MLS, is really a campaign mentality. How do you use this event to create a campaign, to create demand for soccer, which is what campaigns are. You're creating demand for something, a product, a person, a point of view. Um, so all of those things, I felt the lesson is they were all interconnected, and I didn't realize it going in. I didn't think there was a, you know, things would build on each other the quite the way they did. So I was very lucky to be able to take advantage of those opportunities. So that's one thing that's durable. Right? Take
Mm.
advantage of opportunities, see how they relate to each other, even if they're not apparent. Almost every job and career relates to something else, and
Mm.
that something else may be where your path goes. Um, and then I think there's a more personal thing, which is whether it was in the White House or HBO or anywhere, being a good person, being a kind colleague. A lot of these are high pressure situations, and people can be jerks, people lose their temper. But over time, I think, as you progress in your career, um, people want you to be good. People want to hire people who are effective, but people also want to hire people that they want to work with. And, your values, both your hard work and your skills, those are important. But it's also important to be the kind of colleague and person that you know, people hopefully want to work with. And particularly in the nonprofit sector. I mean, that
Yeah.
people aren't joining the sector to get rich. They're joining it because they feel like they want to make a contribution to society. So you're already in a kind of a shared mindset.
Right.
Um, and that's important. And that's really durable too.
And you just said something that made me reflect on a comment I actually made earlier, which was that, um, you know, having worked for Senator Clinton, and then doing some work for the HIV/AIDS initiative, that when you work for the Clintons, you're sort of always in the family.
Yeah.
And how does that translate, that feeling, or that notion that we're always still connected, and if there is anything I need, sometimes the first person I call is a Clinton sort of person. The Bloomberg folks are very similar in that regard,
Very
from what I
similar. Yeah.
found as well. What is it? Talk a little bit about how that ecosystem, if you will, of people and ideas and values translate to the actual work on the ground, if you can. Because that, to me, does people on the outside sort of see that there's that relationship that exists among people in that network.
Yeah. Well, it starts at the top. I mean, we're very lucky to work for people that we believe in, and they themselves are good people. They're caring. They care about the world. They care about the people that work for them and with them, and that makes a huge difference. And when you have that kind of motivation, and I'll come back to politics in a second, um, that ethos really, makes you want to, do your job. And also, in their case, someone asked earlier about sort of the more entrepreneurial part of it. Um, that comes from organizational leadership. If the leadership values entrepreneurship, innovation, taking chances, taking risks, then you'll really be, have a chance to be successful. If there's a different culture, maybe you're not going to be as successful. And what I was going to say about politics is we were both lucky enough to have our um, some of our formative experiences with the Clintons. I remember coming out of the White House, we all, it was the second term. There was a little bit of senioritis, both, we were after some challenging years leaving on a, pretty good things in good shape and felt good about it and everybody was excited. But we also knew we had to leave. I think a lot of people would have stayed if they could because we really loved the job. But they're like, there's a term limit and you got to go on, just like you got to graduate college. Um, so people who wanted to stay involved in politics, particularly Clinton people, then got involved, a few years later in the 2004 campaign. And without saying anything specific about a candidate, I think at least myself and a lot of other colleagues found that, they didn't have quite the same passion for the candidates, at least on the Democratic side, as we did for the Clintons. Now, some of that is formative, some of that is just the people. Some of it may be, when you get when you start out on particularly your first presidential campaign, it really does feel like a mission. And maybe by the time you've done
Yeah,
several of
it
them,
feels
it kind
it's
of
work.
feels like it's work, it's your job,
That's
and you're
right.
not as invested in it. So,
Yeah.
finding ways to keep yourself motivated and really believing in the people you're doing it for, really, you're very lucky if you can do that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that, and I think to 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 put a point on that, I mean, you get to a place where, right, you realize it may not be politics per se that you love, it's the people you work for that you really loved and enjoyed and learned a lot from. So for a lot of our students that are on the call and current and prospective, we do teach a class in nonprofit leadership and management, and that is a core course. And those are the kinds of values that we talk about. That leadership really does matter. And when you're trying to, and I imagine you totally see this all the time, right? Not only are you trying to motivate staff, but you're communicating those values to funders. You're trying to build a volunteer base. That leadership and that sentiment does carry through.
Yeah, I'll give you an example that we did with the Clinton Foundation. So, one challenge that we had was at we've had so many different programs and they all sort of operate slightly differently. We've talked about a few of them, but we also have one called the Alliance for a Healthier Generation, which is responsible for essentially using that model that worked to get more AIDS drugs distributed to get high calorie drinks out of American schools. And
Mm.
so got Pepsi, Coke, and Dr. Pepper to all work together to reduce the caloric intake and availability of sodas in schools. Um, then we've had entrepreneurship programs, we've had college programs, we have a overdose response network right now where we're working with faith leaders. And so you can see, it's a little bit hard to explain sometimes exactly what we do, where the Red Cross helps people recover from disasters. We have 13 different programs and they all work in slightly different ways. And so from a communication standpoint, we're always wrestling with how to describe what we do. So where we landed, which is also important internally as it is externally, is that our tagline, so to speak, is putting people first. So what is that to? Well, number one, that was the '92 campaign theme for President Clinton and Vice President Gore, and it really spoke to what they were hoping to do for the country. It was durable. I mean, people remember it. They also invested. There was a case where we always talk about budgets and things and nonprofits. The '92 campaign spent millions and millions and millions of dollars establishing that idea and that tagline. And so we already come to it with a brand equity and investment that is useful. So that's one thing. Other thing is it really puts the president, Secretary, and Chelsea's values and the organization's value very front and center. We do a lot of different things. At the center of it is people, the people that work here, the people we help, the people who support us. And so when you have a North Star like that, you can use communications to really help everybody align with your mission. And that's one way we do it.
No. Um, Kevin Watson Jr., I always say the junior because I'm a junior and I make sure everybody says that too. Kevin's question: what strategies work best to connect your nonprofit with foundations that share your mission and objectives when your current work or network lacks direct connections? What steps should someone in a new role take to establish meaningful relationships from the ground up?
Well, I think that there's, not only the Flint Global Initiative, but there are a lot of really great convenings and convening organizations. And I think, as we've become a little more fractured digitally, being able to be in person with your colleagues is really important. Um, let's say take communications, for example. There's an organization called ComNet, and ComNet is primarily made up of social sector communicators, nonprofits, other social sector organizations. You know, really starting with the people who have your job at other organizations and starting to join those networks. And you can do it on LinkedIn and other things is really a great starting point. Because even if your work doesn't necessarily overlap, your what you're trying to do and the challenges you have do. And I think one thing, you referenced corporate competition earlier. Um, yeah, at least I found that nonprofits are really wants is invested in helping each other,
Mm.
at least at a personal level. And so building networks like that are really important. And I think in-person convening is a great way to do that.
All right, Craig, we'll get you out of here with this last question. And again, thank you and thank everybody who joined us today. This has been a really wonderful conversation. It's just great to connect with you, man. And thank you
Ah,
so
it's
much
so good to see you.
for joining us. As you and we've talked about it in a number of different ways on the call, but as I've said, we've got a lot of current students, we've got some prospective students, um, and I just would love for you to just close us out with a word about how foundations, nonprofits broadly, foundations specifically, and the kind of work that you do. Um, how do we go, given where we are right now, what do we say to the rest of the world when we're going into other countries, other communities, um, and sharing our values and trying to get funding and support? Some people are afraid. There is a lot of anxiety. Can you give us a word of encouragement or maybe a success story that'll get us, ground us a little bit?
Well, in terms of success stories, I think that you're starting to see more organizations stand up and get together. I know, for example, the ACLU organized a call the other day with hundreds of nonprofits, try to galvanize them. Other nonprofit Council on Foundations is doing something similar. So I think there's a recognition um, around the sector that united we stand, divided we fall, and that is going to continue to take hold. Um, Listen, I think there are a lot of successes out there at a macro level, micro level that we just need to talk about and be proud of talking about. Like the more that we can show the example of what it means when organizations like Direct Relief rallied the private sector to help with Ebola relief. I mean, that is a very tangible thing that people, can understand. And really making, all of us as communicators telling those stories to not just on social media, in person, with your family, your friends, your communities, like, having a couple of examples of things that you find important and interesting that are relatable. I think we broadly. I mean, we are in an incredibly challenging time. I would argue that it's man-made versus some of the other challenging times that we've been through. But nevertheless, we've been through very, very challenging times as a country and a community, and we've made it through. And as President, Clinton said in one of his inaugurals, there's nothing wrong with America that can't be fixed by what's right with America. And I certainly still believe that, and it gives me a lot of hope.
That's a great note to end on. Craig Minassian, thank you so much for your time and the work that you do. We're going to probably call you a few more times, man. And we'd love to collaborate on some work going forward. So thank you so much.
I thank you for having me. Good luck to everybody. Please consider me a resource. Thank you for sharing your afternoon with me. It's great to see you.
Good to see you, and for all that joined us, thank you again for being a part of our Lunch and Learns. There'll be more information about all of our work going forward, and this will be up and posted for others to take a look at. So once again, thank you all for being with us, and look out for what we have coming up next. Have a good weekend.
Take care.